Hello, this is my presentation showcasing my product for component 2 of the production project module. Today I will be showing my final product and the process I took to create the product. This is my final product and a breakdown of the product. This is the plan of action I wanted to go forward with for this project. I first had to come up with an idea and then develop the idea into a drawing. Once I did that, I could properly begin the project by setting up the scene and then using simple shapes to block out the scene and create a camera movement. Once I was satisfied, I would detail the scene and the assets, add texture, bring in more detail to the scene if needed, and then render. I would then bring the renders into Nuke where I would begin compositing, color correcting, and grading the scene. These are some of the image references that I used to help me come up with my idea and drawing. The idea of my project was to create a 3D map painting environment. The scene would be set up so that the camera follows a path which leads to a city surrounded by a mountainous view. Here are some concept drawings that I did. The first picture shows several paths of stairs. The next is a drawing of another view of the path. And the last picture is a drawing of the landscape. After drawing my ideas, I then began to set up my project in Maya. I first created simple shapes using Maya's sculpt tool to represent mountains. This was to block out the scene and create camera movement. Once I was satisfied with the blocking out of the scene, I then created the layout of the path. I first did a simple path in Maya, and then I brought that into ZBrush, where I added more details such as noise to create bumps on the ground. I also did the same for all the assets of the ruin, such as the columns and bricks and the stairs as well. I modeled it out in Maya first, and then once I did that, I took it into ZBrush where I added more detail such as cracks and bumps. Here you can see that I placed the assets that I created into the scene in the foreground. This is so I could see how it would look like with the camera movement and the mountain background. This is my video test render, just so I could see how it would look like, and I found that the mountain scaling wasn't right as it felt too near to the foreground, and when I rendered it I could see that a lot of the path assets were not correctly placed either, as they were going through the ground. Because of that test render, I found that I needed to redraw my landscape so that I can get the scaling right. So I did another drawing. You see the village in the left background. Also added an island in the middle. It's mostly based on the image on the right. I redid the blocking out of the scene with the new layout that I redrew, and so I did another test render to see how it would look, and I was much happier with this than the previous one. I was pleased with the new layout of my scene, so I was ready to move on to the next step of detailing everything. For my production project dissertation, I had looked at procedural terrain generation softwares and the advantages of using them. I had come across World Machine, which is a software that can create various terrains with textures such as mountains. I used this to create a variety of mountains that I could import into Maya and use for my scene. I placed the World Machine mountains that I created into the scene, replacing the simple block out mountains, and I did a test render to see how it would look. I also began texturing my assets. I brought my UV unwrapped modeled assets into Substance Painter and began layering different materials such as rock and moss to create a texture I could export into Maya. I did a test render with the textures included. I now began detailing the scene. I brought some assets such as trees and grass from online and placed them into the scene. I also got buildings from Kitbash and placed them in the background to represent the village in my scene. After completing the scene in Maya, I then rendered it out. I had to separate each object into foreground, middle ground, and background layers and did multi-pass renders of each one. This was so I could bring it into Nuke and edit the map in more detail later, such as editing the specular or the diffuse pass. After rendering, I imported the layers into Nuke and began compositing by organizing the different layers and then merging them with one another. I was going for a dark fantasy genre for my map painting, so I got reference images online from artists and movies to see the color palette they used for this type of genre. With this reference, I was able to adjust the grade and do some color corrections on the passes to match the images. As the sky background was empty, I had to find an image online to use. I took one frame from the Maya renders, which gave a view of the whole background, and imported it into Photoshop. I then placed a sky image behind the render to see how it would look. As it felt empty, I added another mountain image. I then exported the sky and mountain image into separate layers and placed them into separate cards in Nuke. To get the sky and mountain to follow the same movement as the Maya renders, I had to export the Maya camera and connect it into the card. Finally, I wanted to give the map painting more depth, so I added more effects to the scene. I added rain overlays and lightning flashes to match with the whole dark and sinister look I was going for. Here is my final product again. Thank you for watching my presentation.